Hello everyone and welcome back to Tidal Gardens. This video will actually be the first installment of the Becka's tank series that everyone asked for in the comments of my last video. So today I'm going to be throwing some tank concepts out there into the void and hope that one of them sticks. Hopefully some of you guys might be able to help me out in that whole decision-making process as well. Since I don't know a lot about tank design, I decided to go into this like a child would if they were to design an aquascape by themselves. So these ideas may or may not be feasible, but we can do some brainstorming together and see what ideas kind of come out of that. So without further ado, let's dive into it. All right, so the first tank structure I had in mind was a simple 134-gallon cube. That itself is a bit boring, so I was thinking of different ways to make this thing look incredible. What I ended up going with was, what if in the center of the tank we had a rock structure that looked sort of like a tree? A sturdy trunk-like center branching off towards the top. The trunk could incorporate various types of encrusting corals such as Montipora, Leptoceras, or Samacora to cover that entire trunk area in a bunch of super cool colors. Even if we ended up getting some plating versions of Montipora, that could also lead to some pretty neat textures as well. For the leafy part of this whole tree rock situation, we can include a few different kinds of LPS, such as Duncans, Elegances, or even some torches along the edge to give a wispy, weeping willow sort of effect. All of these corals would have to be green in some way, shape, or form to kind of go with that whole foliage vibe, but everything else is fair game. Now, we have a tree in the middle of this tank, right? What about the bottom? Well, now that we have this mythical tree thing happening, why not include a field of flowers, or in this case, zoanthids, to go along with it? The zoanthids would be spaced all along the bottom of the tank to finish off this mystical forest fantasy tank. In terms of fish for this style of tank, the first fish that comes to mind would be clownfish. I mean, we already have a bunch of flowing LPS on top, so it would be perfect for them to hide in, and I've always wanted to keep clowns, so why not? Other fish I could possibly throw in there might be a yellow tang, a copper band butterfly, and maybe a couple cardinals as well. There are pros and cons for all tank options, obviously. This one here is a good choice because it has a simple design accompanied by a large volume, which allows me more creative freedom when it comes to designing. However, the large volume comes at a cost. Since this tank is on the larger side, it'll definitely be harder to maintain, especially for someone like myself who isn't as experienced. To help combat this, we could have the tank put on a shorter stand, but that would leave little room for a sump underneath. So that is my whole thought process for this 134-gallon tree-themed tank. Now on to the next one. So my next reef tank that I had in mind was actually a shallow reef tank. This kind of tank is a little restricting on design due to the depth, but I feel like it would be a little bit easier for me to manage. For this tank, I'd also want clownfish, no shocker there, but compared to the last tank, this tank will be a little bit more centered around the clownfish themselves instead of just having them along for the ride. So for starters, I'd like to put an elegance into one end of the tank and then maybe add a couple frog spawn to the other end to give the clownfish a few different hosting options. They may not even use them, but hey, it's a nice option. In the middle of the tank, I'd like to have some rockwork in the shape of 2 or 3 small archways for the fish to swim through. The archways in this tank I would want to be covered by different kinds of mushrooms, because why not? Mushrooms are super cool. That's literally the only reason. Some Rhodactis and Discosoma mushrooms I think would look best. I know that in my last video, I said that Rickordia yumas were my favorite kind of mushroom. However, due to that kind of mushroom being very particular and me not being very experienced in coral care, I decided to let that dream go and instead add mushrooms that are a little bit hardier and easier to take care of. Now, since the bottom of this tank is looking a little bare besides the substrate that I would probably add to the bottom, I might add some zoanthid patches to the bottom, not necessarily to cover the whole bottom of the tank, but just enough to add more pops of color. I'm thinking magicians for sure, maybe some blue steel zoanthids, and why don't we throw in some rastas, because why not? Having clownfish alone, however, isn't very helpful in terms of a cleanup crew, so I figured along with the clownfish, I would throw in some bigger snails and a cleaner shrimp as well. I might also want to add a couple of mangroves growing out of the water. I've always been a big plant person myself, so if I have the chance to add plants to my tank that grow out of the water, it would be weird to not do that. When it comes to this tank, the pros and cons are flipped in comparison to the first one I mentioned. The pros, the shallow tank is a lot easier to maintain in comparison to the deeper tank, and the cons is there's a little less creative freedom when it comes to rockscapes and things like that due to how shallow the tank is. Another problem that could arise has to do with fish. The fish we have had here, for instance, tend to be a lot more calm in deeper tanks. In shallow tanks, they all seem to be a little bit more neurotic and panicky, especially tangs and fox faces. So as long as I stick to smaller fish, such as the clowns, that should be okay. No big fish for this tank. So yeah, that's my ideas for a shallow reef aquarium. All right, so on to my third tank. This tank structure alone is super interesting and is actually a combination of the two previous tanks. My next option for an aquarium would be a drop-off style tank. So I would be able to have the best of both worlds with a shallow area as well as a deeper area for different types of corals. Just because this tank is essentially a combination of the two previous tanks, that doesn't mean I'm going to design them the exact same way and then mash them together. I have to find a way to make their designs kind of flow together. So what I have come up with is this. The main rockscape in this tank will kind of flow along the wall of the drop-off, starting from the top and draping down towards the bottom. Once I have a bunch of corals growing off the rock, it'll add a lot more movement to the tank than if I were to have two separate rockscapes in the deep and shallow ends. Starting with the shallower portion of the tank, I would like to use this portion of the tank for mainly acropora and possibly a cool-looking trachybrain. This way I can incorporate at least one of my favorite acropora varieties into my tank design, and this will eventually flow to the edge of the drop-off where I will start to incorporate more encrusting type corals combined with corals that provide a little bit more movement, such as goniopora, pipe organs, torches, and frog spawn, etc. Now moving on to fish for this tank. Unlike the other two tanks, I don't really want to have clownfish in here, and I'll explain why in a minute. Instead, I would like to have a copper band butterfly, a tang or two. I think a blue hippo tang and an Achilles tang would look super cool in this tank. A fox face and maybe a larger wrasse of some sort. You may have noticed that I'm opting for some bigger fish, and that has to do with why I didn't want clowns in this tank. The main attraction for this tank would be, drumroll please, an eel of some sort. Preferably a snowflake eel since they're shorter in length compared to something like a banded eel that needs a lot more space. Eels tend to eat smaller fish that can fit in their mouths, which is why I decided to go with a stockier bunch of fish so that doesn't end up happening. I just think that having an eel in my tank would be pretty awesome to see, despite the fact that I can't make Finding Nemo references about my clownfish going to the drop-off. Now, the obvious pro of this tank is that it's really unique and not something everyone's going to have. However, that also ties into a con about this tank as well. Since this is a very unique tank, it is very hard to source. Mass-produced drop-off tanks are often out of stock, leaving our only option to be getting one custom made. Now, I'm no mathematician, but that sounds like it's going to be a lot more expensive than getting one pre-made. And even then, the quality might not be great because the custom maker may not be comfortable creating that sort of shape. And on top of that, the stand also has to be custom made because of the two different levels associated with the drop-off. It's a bit of an engineering execution nightmare, but hey, it looks cool. Okay, so now we're at the fourth tank on my list. The first three tanks on my list were on the bigger side of things, and it made me think, what if I have a tank that's small enough to put on my desk? This gave me the idea to possibly do a 15-gallon nano tank. Nano tanks, unfortunately, leave very little room to create really cool rockscapes or have an eel as its main tenant. So what are some ways we can spice things up to make this tank a little more interesting? For this tank, I was thinking about having a bunch of eye-catching colors to really make it stand out. A full-on rave tank, if you will. The brighter the better. So for the center of this tank, I was thinking of adding a scolinia to the tank, preferably a master or war paint scoli, or a really colorful acanthophilia. Around that centerpiece coral, I like to have a smaller archway rockscape going over the top of it to put other smaller corals on there, like maybe some mushrooms, favia, and maybe some platinum halo montipora. These corals, I've noticed, have some magnificent color under blue light, and that would be perfect for this neon tank. Now don't think I've left out any zoanthids. I'll have some of those on the bottom of the tank. Hopefully I'll be able to include some Sun Eaters as well as some Devil's Armor, maybe some Bowsers, Goblin's Fire. If you have any other suggestions for me for really bright in-your-face zoanthids, let me know. Now, depending on space, another coral I'd like to try and add would be the Electric Lemonade Anacropora. Mainly because, one, I like the name a lot, and two, the colors would do really well in a tank like this. My only issue with this coral is that I'm not entirely sure I'll have enough space for it, so I'd have to get everything set up and make the decision afterwards. Fish for this tank would have to be pretty small as well, so I'm thinking maybe a couple damsels and a cardinal combined with some snails to really round out this cleaning crew. The only thing that I'm worried about with this tank being a desk tank is the fact that I have some pretty expensive equipment that I use to edit photo and video. I would rather not like to get any water on any of that for obvious reasons. There's always room for error when it comes to something like this, so I'm either going to have to rearrange my desk to keep it as far away from my computer and power strip as possible, or just end up putting it somewhere else. Now, another thing with this tank is it may seem like the perfect tank for me because it's small. However, a lot of things can happen a lot faster in tiny aquariums than they do in bigger aquariums. So with this tank, I would have to be constantly on my toes to watch out for any possible disruptions. That, in hindsight, would kind of be good practice for me to be able to watch out for different things, but it can still be hard. And also, since this tank is small, it has limited stocking and design options, so that's another thing to worry about. However, the best thing about this tank is that it can be really good quality and also really inexpensive at the same time. Okay, now moving on to my final tank option. I have been warned that this tank may be a tad controversial and most will not like the idea, but bear with me for a second. I thought about doing a cylinder style tank. Wait. The only reason I would want to do a tank like this is because I think it would be really cool to make a spiral rock structure go inside, and the cylinder shape seems the most appropriate for something like this. However, why on earth would I stop there? Why not make it a rainbow spiral? Like place corals on the rock according to their colors in your standard Roy G. Biv rainbow order? I don't know how well that would turn out, but I don't see why not. For reds, I could definitely throw in some ultra red Goniopora. Green would be super easy to find stuff for, and for purple, an all-star acro would look awesome. As for fish, I think it would be really cool to have a bunch of flashing tile fish in this tank. Since they are prone to flashing different colors, I think they would be a perfect fit for this rainbow-themed tank. Along with the small school of tile fish, I would also want a couple of different tangs and a copper band, but the fish I would love to have in this tank would be a psychedelic mandarin. Since this fish is a rainbow in itself, it would be a perfect fit for the floor of this tank. So when I said that this is a controversial tank, what I really meant is that it is an absolute maintenance nightmare. This is not only because it can be a bit difficult to clean due to the height, but cylinder tanks made of glass are not that common. That means that most of these tanks are made out of acrylic, which can scratch a lot easier than glass when you're cleaning it. To top it all off, the shape of this tank also brings a lot of distortion along with it. But hey, like I said before with the drop-off tank, it looks cool, so I think that cancels out everything, right? Alright everyone, that kind of does it for my top 5 tank ideas. What do you guys think of my choices? Do any of you guys have these types of tanks? And if you do, what have your experiences been like with maintenance and different things like that? If any of you guys have any tips or helpful advice for any of these designs, I would definitely appreciate it because again, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I would really appreciate it. So feel free to leave that in the comments down below. And until next time, happy reefing. In a bunch of super cool colors. Yes, that's how you say that. Some sort, a couple, that's a fish. Having clownfish alone, that morphed into one word. What? It's not on the tool table? Oh. Having clownfish. Can you leave? Since this is a very unique, I'm Australian now. You ever think about that? I have a name. And that's what you're known as. It's just a word. I don't know, it's too early for this. To put other small, I'm gonna reboot for a second. Any of you guys have any tips or